Well, good thing I didn't bet on the tariffs being delayed again. I guess I can be proven wrong tomorrow morning or the morning of when this is uploaded, but we shall see if this part of the video makes it in. I certainly hope it doesn't. Regardless, I have a few pages that I wanted to share on what I thought was important for people to know and act on when it came to fighting in this almost said impending but imminent trade war. If you don't think it started already, which I think is reasonable given the aluminum and steel tariffs that were announced. But regardless, the market agrees with me that it's not a good thing. The DJA, S&P 500, and Nasdaq were all down between 1.4 and 2.6%. There were retaliatory tariffs announced, which I don't think are enough, even though it's 155 billion, and that sounds like a lot when you consider what the amount of goods being exported from Canada are 412 billion. That's a less than half, nearly a third of what the amount being sent across the border is. So I don't think it's sufficient, but that's just the first part, and hopefully we'll see more. I think this difference has to be made up by Canadians and our global allies. And there's a lot of different ways that this can be done. Um, I want to start off on a positive note and say I've been super happy with how the Buy Canadian movement seems to be growing. One of the things that I think really makes a difference isn't just people saying that they'll choose Canadian over different products. It's the willingness to spend a little bit extra on those Canadian goods or non-American goods. And there was a survey that I wanted to highlight from this global news article where it said 53% of Canadians were willing to pay $5 or more to buy a local product. And another 33%, so a third, said that they'd be willing to spend an extra $10. I don't know what the base item value was. I'm sure people wouldn't be willing to spend $5 more on a $2 item. But depending on what that ratio is, it could be fairly significant. Another little note here was that 80% of people said that they were likely to choose Canadian made products over imported ones. Though when it comes to actually making purchasing decisions, the people that are willing to pay more are the ones that are going to make the bigger difference in the long run. And that 80% might not even really tell the whole story on what the actual transaction difference might be. And I found this in a CTV news article, and it was talking about how Shopify saw one of their suppliers who shared their information, saying that their memory foam mattresses stocked by Canadian merchants surged 213% between January and February. So that, again, small sample size, but that's a pretty significant increase in sales. I don't know if January is peak mattress buying season. I'm trying to think of other reasons why there might be a large jump in people buying mattresses, but January in Canada is not exactly a peak time for people to be moving or replacing their household goods just because you have to deal with the cold outside and the door being opened. No, don't go outside. Another thing that I found interesting was a subreddit that I had joined a couple years ago and remember not seeing a whole lot of activity on. Um, had a giant surge in usership, and that was the Buy Canadian subreddit. So the Buy Canadian subreddit had somewhat exploded at the end of January and then kind of continued growing through February, and I expect will continue growing as well. So aside from buying Canadian, um, I think another big aspect to this is on the investment side. Um, Canadians hold a lot of US equities, while um, Americans have a stock of 440 billion approximately in foreign direct investments in Canada. That in the inverse case, Canada owns 683 billion. So again, that's almost 50% more. That's over 250 billion in US dollars net that Canadians own more in the US market. So Canadians generally own a lot more US equity. I think mostly due to American media being pervasive in Canadian society. So the financial talking heads that Americans trust, Canadians also trust. Whereas I think the only example of a Canadian involved in finance that Americans have ever heard of is probably what's his name? Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank, who is in fact not wonderful, and I would recommend watching Patrick Boyle's videos on Mr. Wonderful. I'll link those in the description. So there's an opportunity with Canadians holding all of the US shares, and this is on the Canadian data side from StatsCan. Canadian investors are strongly exposed to United States financial markets. At the end of the third quarter of 2024, 59% of Canada's international assets were in the United States. It was 49.5% 10 years ago. So it's like a 10% or 10 percentage points higher than a decade ago. And Canadian holdings of US equity instruments, both direct and portfolio, largely contributed to the increase over that period. So I'm gonna blame Warren Buffett for this one, telling everyone to buy S&P 500 index funds. And from looking at different Reddit threads about what Canadians own, often it's a lot of US equities. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for Canadians to switch their funds over to Canadian equities and European equities. And if you wanted more growth, looking at, supporting our other allies in the trade war, Mexico and soon to be Europe. The reason why I kind of going against my intuition in telling people to sell off their US assets and kind of take a strong stance on that is that I also don't have a whole lot of confidence in the US market as a whole right now. If you look at historic PE ratios of the S&P 500 and some other US indexes also follow this trend, is that it's ridiculously overvalued. The global average for PE ratios is closer to 10 to 20%, depending on the markets and the time. I remember when I was in school, this was, almost a decade ago, One of the things that is stuck in my head is 15% is like a reasonable PE ratio. Thanks, Warren Buffett. We were talking about you. And as you can see here, not only are we well above uh, 15 and 20, which is usually what I believe is like a more American average. And you can see here over time, the average PE ratio of the S&P 500 is 19.3%. So close to that 20 number. And we're getting very close to being one whole standard deviation above that 20. At 30, that's quite highly overvalued, and you can see how often the market has been, oh my god, Warren Buffett, please stop, has gone over 20. It's quite rare and usually isn't in the best economic circumstances. So I would anticipate to see a pullback. That's also not just going off of the charts, but just using some common sense related to current account deficits. Donald Trump really seems to hate the fact that America is running a current account deficit. But from an economic standpoint, it's not necessarily a bad thing. There's positives and negatives to having the current account deficit. And one of the things that the US has really taken advantage of is the world's willingness to buy American stocks. And we can see here the second thing that foreign companies or foreign nationals or foreign governments can do with those US dollars when they've exported more than they've imported from the US is investing them in American securities. I see this being one of the biggest changes when it comes to the consequences of unwinding a trade deficit is going to be that the American stock market is going to take a hit. So we have two different things so far that you can do to make a difference and to fight in this trade war. The third thing is to subscribe to my YouTube channel because of a Canadian creator, and I'd appreciate support from wherever it comes from. And number four, we'll let Donald Trump give you advice on what to do. So what you would do is you go to an American store and
$950 you're allowed to steal.
No. I would never condone stealing from Walmart. That's very wrong. Can't believe you would say that, Donald. So Canadians have a lot of options and hopefully a lot of allies. And I think one of the most important things to remember is that we gotta stick together on this one. There isn't a whole lot that we can do to control other states, other foreign actors, but there's a lot we can do to control our own actions, and being conscious of that and highly intentional, I think is going to make a big difference in the long run. So thanks